Good morning, good afternoon for those of you in the room and joining us online. Thank you for those who are joining us after their lunch break, and welcome to those who are starting afresh on today's event with this panel. So this particular session will focus on the governance of cloud computing. It will delve into the general cloud computing governance landscape and unpack key governance challenges and issues, as well as touch upon the role of various stakeholders in cloud computing governance. Additionally, it will also delve into some arms control implications of cloud computing, notably with regards to non-proliferation of technologies and software. And to do that today, I have here with me three distinguished speakers. To my right, I have Ms. May-Ann Lim, who is the director of the data governance team at Access Partnership and is currently the emeritus director of the Asia Cloud Computing Association. To my left, I have Mr. Nicholas Ott, who is a senior manager at Microsoft European Government Affairs. And online is Dr. Mark Bromley, who is a director of the CIPRI Dual Use and Arms Trade Control Program. We only have 1 hour for the session, so without further ado, I propose we turn directly and hear from our three speakers. We'll first hear presentations, and this will then be followed by a Q&A. So for those in the room and online, don't forget to start preparing your questions early. So I propose we start with you first, May-Ann, to learn more about the cloud computing governance landscape more broadly and government policies that exist to address risks. The floor is yours.
Linking. Okay, great. Hi, everybody. My name is May-Ann. I hail from Singapore. I am the Emeritus Director of the Asia Cloud Computing Association and also the Director of Data Governance at Access Partnership. I deal a lot with cloud computing issues, data center issues for the last 15 years of my life already. And I'll give you a quick overview of what I've been seeing, especially historically, as well as today, what we're dealing with when it comes to international governance. I've got slide decks, and I'm pretty sure that this can be downloaded after the session, so I will leave you to download it and ping me after that. My contact details are online. Right now, we're looking at the governance of cloud computing, and honestly, it's really second slide. Honestly, it's really about managing applications of cloud computing in data centers and all of their relative components. You do not need to be able to see what's on the screen to understand that there is cloud computing modules, the deployment modules, etc. But you also have management of data centers and their components. I do note that there are people in the room as well as online who are dealing also with things like connectivity, submarine cables, and satellite issues as well. So I think that all of you can actually tell me that there will be different types of applications and different types of hardware and software which will be involved with cloud computing and the applications coming up from cloud computing and data centers. I'm going to dive straight into it with some of the international governance challenges in cloud computing that have come up over the years. Now, I've got 4 slides of this, and instead of just naming the issues themselves, I'm going to put them into buckets of questions, because I think that there are a lot of different new applications. I try not to say AI, but I'll say AI. I'm trying not to repeat too many times AI. There are different applications which will come in as we talk about cloud computing, but the questions generally remain the same. In the first instance, for example, we ask what kind of data is being crunched, whose data is it? And in the last couple of years, we've seen questions arising from personal data, personally identifiable data, anonymized data, pseudonymized data, non-personally identifiable data. They all have data protection regulations, and we are working right now to improve cloud security. Question always comes up with, where are these international governance coordination points? People want to know, because we have a lot of people who say, oh, we don't want to have a local approach towards data governance. We don't want to have a local approach towards managing personal data. But then the question becomes, where are the international governance coordination points for what data is being crunched? Whose data is it? The second question, which I think a lot of the previous panels have also touched on this, where is the data? And this is where I feel that the concepts continue to evolve. When we first came up with cloud computing, people were like, okay, the data is here, and then it moves there, and then it moves there. And people are like, oh, hold on. We have these things called backups. So then people asked, okay, first there is the backup, where is the backup, and where is the data actually? Everybody's okay, no, this doesn't make any sense. Let's come up with new concepts. So we had new concepts: data in transit, data at rest, what is a data intermediary, what is a data processor, etc. They continue to be questions around the physicality of data. It's tied with a lot with internet jurisdictions. The countries are now seeking methods and mechanisms to unlock, to monetize data, cloud computing through developing agreements on data jurisdiction and sovereignty. We continue to have questions about this. The arrangements continue to evolve and develop. Don't think that we have a set answer just yet, which then leads us on to the third question, which is the next slide. Who is actually managing the data? Whose legal responsibility at any given point in time is involved here? Now, this is where we can actually look backwards. And again, everybody who is online and in the room who is based in the telco space, you are probably going to school me on this. Legal responsibility and liability, data responsibility often lies in this idea of intermediary liability. In the telco space, it's usually managed by licenses. But does this, and this is the question, does this then translate into all the applications for cloud computing? I'll give you one example. We've got the social media space, we've got the over-the-top OTT space. India and Malaysia are now saying, okay, for all these OTT regulation, all these OTT companies, we are going to regulate it by making you get licensed with us. And that is creating a huge furor about it, and we are still, again, navigating it. So the question is around passing the responsibility for data across organizations. And this leads us into another concept, which is cross-border transfer of data, cross-border data flows. Now, this is where we start to delineate, okay, hold on, are you a private company, or are you a public organization, or are you a non-governmental organization? And what size are you? A small and medium enterprise? Are you a huge enterprise? Are you a cross-border enterprise? Bottom of my slide in italics, what we're seeing, especially where I come from in Asia Pacific, a lot of organizations, particularly small and medium enterprises, they haven't completed their due diligence on data. They haven't actually segmented their data. They've not completed the data classification and data hygiene management processes. So this has led to a couple of, I won't say knee-jerk reactions, but things which I've just observed. The first is overprotection. Oh, I don't know how to classify my data. Okay, you know what? Forget it. I cannot classify my data, so everything is protected. It doesn't matter how expensive, I would simply protect it. And then you can't move that data because everything is protected. So that's a problem. Or you have some other organizations in some other countries. I kid you not, I had this conversation in a country where there was a data sovereignty regulation. I asked one of the small and medium enterprises, I said, so how are you handling it? They actually whispered back, actually, we're not handling it. We're just waiting for the government to find us, and then we will ask for an exception. I was like, what? So that's not good either, because then the data doesn't get protected. So what happens there? We'll move on to the third challenge. How, therefore, is data being managed? In our previous panel, we actually heard a solution, but one of which is standardization and interoperability. And increasingly, especially again with AI, there's a question around intellectual property rights. Now, the question then becomes, who has the time, who has the ability to manage all of this? And the regulatory compliances, especially for small and medium enterprises, tend to be quite expensive. So I do think that international standardization and interoperability is very, very important and is a way for international regulatory compliance to happen. But I do want to feedback to everybody in the room here, and I'd love to hear your feedback as well. I do think that for small and medium enterprises, it gets quite expensive and it's quite tricky, especially if you've got like 3 people in your company and you're trying to grow and you need to have somebody attend all of these ISO level coordination mechanisms, and everybody's just, no, we don't have the time, especially if it's not even in your time zone. We're talking about work-life balance. It gets very tricky. I'm not going to belabor the next point, which is the question, how is data being protected? Privacy, data protection, security, cybersecurity. I will cross-reference this with legal liability, and I suspect my next panelist is actually going to speak a little bit also around this. Our previous panel also, and if you haven't watched it, you might want to go watch the video recording of it, talking about cybersecurity. We need to figure out a way to keep the data protected. Finally, the fourth slide that I have here on the international governance of cloud computing, some of the core challenges are the emerging challenges, other responsibilities, environment, fair and equitable development. So we need to figure out this idea of how do we make sure that cloud computing does have environmental responsibility and impact? How do we measure it? How do we keep an eye on it? And how do we ensure fair access to technology and manage the digital divide? Related, and that's the last sentence on my slide there, related are the competition issues, first mover advantage issues, market capture, vendor lock-in, how you manage these kinds of things. I don't believe that we have any of the solutions just yet. My penultimate slide, which is the next slide, are what are the needs, therefore, that we need to balance. We've got three groups of organizations which I put up there: private or business, the public, the government, and the people sector. The private sector is concerned with economic growth, monetization, optimization. The public sector is interested in equitable economic growth, sustainable growth, national security. And the people sector is obviously concerned with personal data protection and also ESG, equitable and sustainable growth. How are we going to be managing the regulatory chaos? Again, if you came for our previous slide, our previous panel, you will see Eli, who had, Dr. Eli had a whole bunch of slides on the regulatory chaos and what it entailed, so you can have a look at it. The governance discussions have to help us coordinate better, but how do we do that in a multipolar, multi-text world is the question. We also have to find ways to manage the different levels of development, perhaps a ramp-up approach towards cloud computing and data management regulations is needed first before we start to say, okay, we need to have a regulation, we need to have a legislation around this, or we need to have a standardization. Perhaps frameworks first, perhaps guidelines first. I think that hard lines to go immediately for data, international standards, perhaps especially with new technology, but we need to temper that to avoid immediate pushback, which may not be necessarily the best way to go. And finally, we need to find a way to manage the speed of change versus the needs and motivations of these three sectors, the technical and the policy, the geopolitical, economy balancing, the cost of implementation. So right now we're actually seeing a lot of regulations, a lot of international coordination mechanisms for governance coming up. Consider the Budapest Convention, consider GDPR, CBPR, but there are challenges with these international mechanisms because some things are opt-in. So for example, the Budapest Convention is opt-in. GDPR is EU focused in the first instance. CBPR is APEC countries only. There are obviously also cost to implementation and validity and validation. So these are my contributions, Sarah, to the panel and everybody here. If you'd like more information, I'd be referring you to our Asia Cloud Computing website. We've got a research page there that has information on the impact of data sovereignty on cloud computing in Asia. We've also done a study with Brookings Institute regulating the digital economy, understanding the importance of cross-border data flows in Asia. They are very Asia-centric, but the concepts are actually universal. It just so happens that all the examples that we use are in Asia. Thank you very much for your attention, and I will turn your time back to Sarah.
Thank you very much, Mayan, for this wealth of information that you imparted on us. I think this was fantastic, and I'm sure we'll dig into it deeper at the Q&A. But now turning to you, Nicholas, it would be great to have your insights on the role of industry and the governance of cloud computing. So the floor is yours.
There we go. Great. Well, thank you for having me and for convening not just this panel, but the broader discussion throughout the day. I think it was quite helpful and insightful. We're glad to see that this discussion is also occurring within the UNIDIR framework, so to say. My name is Nicholas Ott. I work in the European Government Affairs team at Microsoft, Brussels-based. Look at me at a little bit the interface, the liaison to the European External Action Service, the European Defence Agency, and NATO, since I cover mostly foreign and security policy issues. And so therefore, what I bring to this discussion today is a little bit of a perspective of how we approach that issue, how we look at it, what are some of the reflections, lessons learned that we've taken out over the past couple of years in the space, and how this actually relates to the cloud developments and the linkages to cybersecurity. Let me first start with the premise that I think the tech sector and a particular cloud service providers had a little bit of a geopolitical awakening as of late. And I think that has caused a shift in thinking, but also I think in the way we engage and operate with governments or within jurisdictions, because it's no longer just the fact that we're simply merely providing a service, but I think be it because of export control discussions, be it because of hybrid warfare operations such as the ones in Ukraine, we do see that suddenly cloud services are playing a critical role in this. There's a whole supply chain ecosystem there as well, and that's something that a lot of those stakeholders were not used to. They were just thinking about, we're providing a service, and whoever wants to use cloud, go for it and just do it, and not really think through what are actually the implications if suddenly the whole dynamics shift. And of course, that also means that suddenly we are at the center of potential attacks or efforts to extract data, as it was, I think, covered very publicly in the last 6 months. So you'll be able to read up on what happened to us. And I'm happy to dive deeper, as well as also how we took our lessons learned from that experience as of late. But I think the first point that I wanted to make in this ecosystem is that now we do see that while cloud computing is continuously growing, and I think the previous panels have covered that extensively why that's the case, it has also become one of the prime targets for state-sponsored cyber attacks. And I think we need to pause here and think a little bit on what does this actually mean? Why are we still operating in an environment where it's largely, well, if not permissible, then at least somewhat accepted that states are totally fine with attacking each other's cloud service providers or infrastructures without significant costs? There's been discussions around more attribution or deterrence for quite some time, but in the end, if you just play it by the numbers, even if providers are able to defend 99% of all attacks that are going against them, if the overall volume of attacks just continues to increase, then just by the mere numbers game, you will have more attacks going through and being successful. I think while we're talking, and we had a discussion about what can be done to improve resilience and redundancy, I think we also have to have a frank conversation about what is permissible state behavior and what we think is adequate and not adequate for states to operate when it comes to the increased criticality and relevance of cloud services. Just alone, I picked out a few data points from our side. We had an increase in attempted password attacks from 3 billion to 30 billion per month just in the last couple of months. And that's something that gives you an idea of how many attempts are out there to go after small, medium-sized, but also large businesses across the board. And that is also reflected in the more sophisticated attacks by APTs. The other point that I wanted to make is just us thinking a little bit more holistically about the cloud as an enabler for security and resilience. In the previous panels, I think we've learned and heard a lot about some of the benefits in terms of what kind of security solutions can be provided at scale fairly rapidly across the board on cloud. But the one thing that surprised me a little bit was almost a negative connotation around redundancy. And I think that's the point where I would like to push back and say, duplication is not necessarily bad. It's actually good for resilience. If we had every single data point or every single data center just once, that's also not in our interest. So while sure, the market might strive for perfection and we don't want duplication either across locations or across competitors, I think for us from a societal resilience point of view, it's actually good to have that. And I think that's something that needs to be acknowledged and appreciated. When we look at this now from in hindsight on the situation in Ukraine, I think it became quite clear that while the Ukrainian government did not permit any kind of storing of government data before the full-scale invasion of Ukraine about 2.5 years ago, the quick shift and adjustment in that regulation to allow to move to the cloud relatively quickly at the beginning of the war actually allowed them to maintain their governmental services throughout the last 2.5 years without major incidents or disruptions. And that's not just because of how well they are in defending their networks, but also because of the effective cooperation with the private sector and the enhanced resiliency as well. And then, of course, there's again this geopolitical component that suddenly, if you move your data into largely NATO territory in a conflict that is happening outside NATO territory, then of course suddenly this whole data residency layer has political connotations that are a whole other ballgame. And so I think that's the piece that we all need to acknowledge and reflect, because that has, of course, implications also toward us as providers of these services, but also for the political discussions that one wants to have. And then the third point that I wanted to make is the recognition of cloud computing as a critical infrastructure in international governance. And that's really is that while cloud is really becoming a crucial for governments in defending their countries, but also understanding how the normative framework and the regulatory framework can move in that direction. We've seen Australia, the United States, and the European Union moving into that direction and saying that this is required, but we haven't really seen that on the international level. But in the end, cyber operations do not occur in a legal vacuum. So while it's good that some nations have moved in that direction to classify cloud as a critical infrastructure, I think moving that on the international level could be quite helpful. And we have quite a lot of good platforms to do that, be it the existing 11 norms of responsible state behavior or some of the other efforts that are happening in this place as we speak, when we look at, for example, the cybercrime treaty negotiations. But really, we have in the cyber norms that exist already two that are specifically linking to critical infrastructure, and that's norm F and G. So there is already a linkage here that could be leveraged. And while norm F focuses on avoiding damage to critical infrastructure, and norm G reinforces the commitment of all states to safeguard critical infrastructure in their jurisdiction, we could really look at, what does this mean as a next logical step? And here, what we proposed is to say, let's add an additional norm that specifically recognizes the cloud as a critical infrastructure. And for that, I'm quickly going to quote you that norm because we spent a lot of time curating that language, so bear with me here. But it goes as follows. States should avoid information and communication technologies, so ICTs, activities contrary to international law that harm critical infrastructure, which includes cloud services and infrastructure. Additionally, they should take appropriate measures to protect critical infrastructure from ICT threats, recognizing the importance of cloud systems in providing essential societal functions and enhanced cybersecurity across critical sectors, unquote. So essentially, what we think here is needed for the international cloud computing governance framework is first and foremost that we recognize it as a critical infrastructure in international law, because that would allow us then as a baseline to really mature the discussions on the international level and supplement that with efforts that we're driving in the private sector. Most recently, what we did was the announcement of the Secure Future Initiative, which is essentially sort of a compilation of our lessons learned from the two most recent significant cyber attacks against us and our customers. And that includes a whole list of commitments that, in the interest of time, I think I'm not going to go through all of them, belabor them, but they're all publicly available. And we just published a new, quite detailed report a few days ago. So if you're interested in how we're approaching the issue and how we're also changing the internal corporate structure and philosophy towards security, then I encourage you to look at it, because it's quite a, in my opinion, extensive and transparent report into the insides of a fairly large company. So quite, I think, revealing, but also insightful as in how we are trying to adjust the direction of the tanker for a security-first ecosystem. And with that, back to you. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Okay, yes, thank you very much, Nicholas. This was very fascinating and really interesting to hear from the perspective of the private sector in terms of the considerations that come within this discussion. And last but certainly not least, I now want to give the floor to Mark for his insights on the cloud computing and non-proliferation nexus. Mark, over to you.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, it might well be least actually. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you well, thank you.
Brilliant. All right, thanks so much. Thanks for organizing this. Sorry I can't be with you in person. Thanks for facilitating me joining you remotely. So I'm going to talk about export controls and cloud computing. So the way in which export controls seek to regulate certain transfers of software and technology through the cloud and the challenges that presents. So what are export controls? So export controls the restrictions that states impose on the trade in military and dual-use items. Dual-use items being civilian items that have possible military applications for reasons of national and international security. So states have agreed a lot of common standards in export controls. They've done this at the international level, for example, through the Arms Trade Treaty, at the multilateral level, through the export control regimes, for example, the Wassenaar Arrangement, which sets standards for both military and dual-use items. And then at the regional level, the most substantive effort there has probably been within the EU, which has regulations that cover both military and dual-use export controls. But in all cases, it is ultimately something that individual states want to and continue to retain final say over. So it's states that determine which transfers are subject to export controls and which transfers are approved and denied. So what relevance does this have for cloud computing? So in addition to physical items, the set of standards, the control lists that have been agreed, particularly at the regime level and at the EU level, they apply to both transfers of physical items, but they also apply to transfers of certain types of technology, which in export control speak refers to blueprints, plans, and diagrams, and software that has been specially designed or necessary for the development, production, or use of controlled items. So there are certain efforts to kind of limit the scope of those controls. So the controls on technology are not meant to apply to basic scientific research, and both the technology and software controls are not meant to apply to items that are in the public domain. But it does leave quite a lot which is subject to export controls. So for example, a diagram that gave detailed schematic information about how to build a missile, software, including AI tools that have been designed to control a combat aircraft or improve its performance. Those would be examples of technology and software that's subject to export controls. In addition, there's also certain types of software which are controlled not because of what they could potentially control or improve the performance of, but what they themselves can do as pieces of software. So the most topical example of that is the controls on what's referred to in the export control world as intrusion software. So the most notable example there is the Pegasus tool, which is developed by NSO Group and which is used by governments to gain remote access to mobile phones and other devices. That's listed as a controlled software. It's an example of intrusion software as described in the Wassenaar Arrangement's dual use list. And then the last kind of aspect of export controls possibly that's relevant here is computers. So computers with a very high level of sophistication are also subject to export controls. So there is a certain logic here. If you have export controls on arms and dual use items, which most developed states have, then these are the types of things that you would want to include in their scope. And these are also things, so certain types of technology, certain types of software, access to very kind of high performance computers. They are all things that can either be transferred or made accessible through cloud computing. So that's the kind of general way in which export controls kind of apply in this space. It has generated and continues to generate a lot of challenges. The notion of what export controls are, that they're defined by the movement of physical items across international borders, doesn't map very well to the world of cloud computing, as has been noted for quite a while now, which refers to enables transfers of intangible items and doesn't want to pay so much attention to geographic territory boundaries. So there's been an attempt to kind of superimpose the model of export controls onto cloud computing. And one of the main challenges that's emerged is that states have done that in different ways. So states agree that export controls should apply to cloud computing, but exactly determining how this should operate has not been discussed really at all at the international level. I don't think it's really been discussed at all at the multilateral level. I don't think there's been significant discussions within the export control regimes about how to do this. And even within the EU, there's been a kind of a struggle to come up with really harmonized standards for how this should work. So states have come out with their own national positions on how this should work, and there's small but kind of substantive differences about how they're thinking about this. And I think there's three ways in which states kind of differ on this. So the first is, when does an export actually happen? So some states have indicated that an export happens in the world of cloud computing when you transfer controlled software or technology from out of a national territory. So if you're transferring the technology to a server that's based outside of a national territory, then that's what constitutes an export. Whereas other states have focused less on the act of transferring the data and more on the act of accessing it. So the thing that constitutes an export is more the act of providing access to the controlled software or technology and not the geographic location of the server where it's based. So that's one kind of point of difference. The second is whether or not companies that are providing or using cloud services should be required or recommended to ensure that the data is encrypted. So I mean, there are kind of recommendations on encryption, obviously, but in terms of how states then move those recommendations across to their export controls, there's some key differences here. So some states have indicated that a transfer to a server located outside of their borders is not an export as long as the data is encrypted. And what does constitute an export is the provision of the key to decrypt the data. In other states, there might be recommendations on encryption, but in the export control world, it doesn't really make a difference whether or not the data is encrypted or not. The standards on whether an export happens apply irrespective of the extent to which the data is encrypted. And then the last one, which is kind of getting quite a lot of attention in the last 6 to 12 months, is whether or not access to controlled software in a software as a service model constitutes an export. So some states have come out and said that, or at least indicated, that software as a service does not constitute an export unless the end user that's seeking to access the software is subject to sanctions measures or other specific end use controls. While others have indicated that they don't really see a distinction between downloading and using controlled software, and that software as a service constitutes an export regardless of whether or not the software is actually downloaded. The act of using controlled software is an export even in a software as a service model. Now, it's quite a significant point because a lot of the software that states want to make subject to export controls, including some of the kind of advanced computers that states are trying to restrict control on through their export control measures, intrusion software that I've mentioned earlier. I think in a lot of cases, they can be made available using software as a service models. So it's a very kind of key issue at the moment, I think, whether or not states are viewing access to software under those models as an export or not. So what does this generate? So on the one hand, there's very significant compliance challenges here. So for the companies that want to comply with export controls, either when they're providing cloud services or using cloud services to share or make available or transfer control technology and software, there is a challenge here that different states are applying different standards. And there's an effort to try and to standardize these to a certain extent. But there's also obviously a very significant enforcement challenge here as well. So it's not just about the companies that want to comply with the controls. It's also about detecting the transfers by the companies that don't want to comply with the controls or are seeking to bypass the controls. So the issue of enforcement, export controls in cloud computing has been discussed for quite a while. One of the issues that obviously comes up is this issue of detection, that nothing physical is crossing an international border. So it's very hard to detect, or almost impossible to detect, unlicensed exports. I think that the point that I often make here is that, so when it comes to export controls, and particularly dual use export controls and detection, it's all hard. Like, it's all really difficult. I mean, if you've ever seen a picture of Rotterdam Harbor or Shanghai, there's like gazillions of kind of shipping containers, and you're meant to try and find like a centrifuge or something. So detecting unlicensed dual use export controls in general is incredibly difficult. So it's not so much that it's particularly difficult with cloud computing. All kind of most interdiction efforts will be kind of intelligence led, and that will apply in the world of cloud computing as it does to physical transfers. But there is certainly a case to be made that the investigation and prosecution of export control violations that happen when the transfer happens through the cloud is particularly challenging in a way that is a bit different from physical transfers. So you're requiring kind of customs and enforcement agencies to have skills in digital forensics and other kind of advanced methods that many states, particularly smaller states, wouldn't necessarily have access to. So there is a challenge there, certainly, from an enforcement perspective. But I think the particularities of it are potentially more on the investigation and prosecution side and less so on the detection side. So responses to these challenges, I think it's already been a kind of common thread, both from the previous session and this one, but cooperation between industry and governments here. It's certainly an aspect of export controls that can only operate if industry is working in partnership with governments. So creating mechanisms through which the companies that are developing and using these tools and want to apply export controls can engage with the processes where these controls are being drafted, both at the national and the regional level, to give their input. I think there's clearly a kind of need to kind of standardize these controls a bit. So the states that have thought about this the most are probably, the US and then European states. I think creating complete alignment with how the US and Europe handle this is going to be challenging, given that both of them have gone quite far in terms of thinking about how to apply export controls in this space. But certainly at the EU level, there could be scope for states to become more aligned in terms of how they think about the application of export controls. And as has happened in other areas of export controls, the standards that the EU applies could become practices that other states in other parts of the world might want to adopt. And then lastly, capacity building for states. This is very much at the frontier of export controls. And if states are going to enforce these controls, they're going to need a lot more capacity to be able to detect, investigate, and prosecute any violations that take place. But I will hand back. Thank you very much. Hopefully some time for questions.
Thank you very much, Mark. I think that was brilliant and really illustrated the scope of the issue as it regards to export controls. I do encourage the audience and the participants to ask their questions. But before that, I will enforce my moderator privileges and ask a few questions myself. Perfect. Well, thank you very much, everyone, both attendees and speakers, for your active participation and wealth of information provided. I just want to note that the recording will be made available without the Q&A, so you will be able to watch it again afterwards on our channels, and a paper will also be forthcoming on this topic by the end of this year. With that, big round of applause to everyone, and thank you very much for coming.
Thank you, Mark.
Thanks a lot, Mark.
All right, thanks so much. Have a great afternoon. Bye-bye.
You too. Bye.